Que pasa del Rio? How are you guys? Come on, do better than that for me. How are you today? Okay, that's about as much Spanish as you get from this weather, sorry. I have the distinct honor, well, first of all, how many of you have heard of a little radio show called Coast to Coast AM? I have the honor of introducing the host of the show. You may know this, he's a 3-time Emmy Award winner. He's your host you listen to every night. Please put your hands together for Mr. George Noory.
Hello, Del Rio. What a great crowd. South of the border. So I flew in from St. Louis, where I was, to meet up with Tom, who came in from Los Angeles, and we converged at the San Antonio airport, of which they told me it would be just a short drive. You know, it took longer to get here from the airport than it did to fly in from St. Louis. So I landed at about 3:30 yesterday afternoon. Tom landed at about 4:50, so I hung around at the airport and waited for him. And when I got here, and when he got here, the plan was to have a driver pick us up at the airport. I ain't driving to Del Rio on my own. And so we went outside per the instructions to wait for the ride. And waited. And waited. And waited. So I looked at Tom and I said, Tom, there's no ride here. What happened? And he said, I don't know what happened, but we got to get to Del Rio. It's a 2.5 to 3 hour drive. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, it takes that long. I said, what are we going to do? Can't call a limo, it costs too much for me, or what are we going to do? He said, take this bus. So we got into this bus. I was going by and it said Del Rio at the top. We got in and sat in the front seat. And we realized as it took off, we were in a senior citizens bus. Nothing wrong with that. A few years I'll be in that bus. And so onward we went. I figured we're gonna get there. And every 10 minutes or so, a little old lady, she must have been 90 years old, gets up and walks up to the bus driver. While we're moving, the bus is shaking and she's rattling, and hands him a handful of peanuts, of which he gobbles down. She hands it to him, he munches on them, she goes back. This happens about 3 times. On the 4th time, and it's really getting strange, she comes up again with a handful of peanuts, gives it to the driver, he pops them down in his mouth. Finally, the driver says to her, lady, don't you guys back there like peanuts? And she says, no, we love peanuts. We just don't have any teeth. We suck the chocolate off them first. That was my bus ride to Del Rio. Actually, we got picked up by Ruben Uriarte. And as we were sitting in the back seat of the van, Tom would go to the front and give him a handful of peanuts. Look, thanks for coming out here today. We're going to have a great time. We've got a meet and greet later on this afternoon as well. You have your programs, so you know most of the people here, but let me do a brief introduction. On my immediate left, of course, is Nick Pope, former member of the Ministry of Defense in Britain, where he peeked at UFO files, noted author as well. He'll tell you a little bit about his work. Nick Pope, ladies and gentlemen. And then, of course, is my dear friend Jim Mars, noted author, JFK Investigation. I tell you, when he's on Coast to Coast, the phones light up. He's just riveting. Jim Mars, thanks, Jim. And there's what is our driver doing on the panel? He's a great researcher. He and Noe have written a number of books. They'll tell you about their latest, but it, of course, also includes the book on the other Roswell, Ruben Uriarte. And then, of course, the guy who's been running around putting on a lot of this event for the Chamber of Commerce here of Del Rio, a noted author as well, Noe Torres. What we're going to do is just chat a little bit. I'm going to ask them some questions, and we'll take some from you. These gentlemen have literally devoted their careers toward investigating the unknown. And that, of course, includes the incredible subject of UFOs and extraterrestrials. Just recently, the CIA released more declassified documents about UFOs. Of course, 90% of them are all blacked out. Couldn't read anything. But they really have. This is an important subject to them. And let's start with you, Nick. You have a passion for this. You've been doing this for a number of years. You don't stop. Why not?
Well, I think the reason I don't stop is that I like to say that the question, are we alone or not in the universe, and the related question of are we being visited, is one of the biggest and most profound questions that we can ask ourselves. And it would also be one of the most impactful. If we encounter another civilization, it doesn't matter, in a sense, how it happens. Yeah, you read a lot about this. It might be the archetypal landing on the White House lawn. It might be picking up a signal with a radio telescope. It might be NASA announcing something. Or it might be another one of these document dumps that we've read about just this week. But whatever form it takes, if it is revealed that there is indeed other life out there, I think almost every aspect of our lives will change. Our politics, our religion, our personal philosophy, our paradigm, our worldview, whatever. You know, almost every aspect will be impacted. And above all, perhaps, our science and technology. So that's why, you know, we talk about what are the big issues and what are the big questions. This would undoubtedly be one of the issues that would have more consequences than almost anything else I can think about. And it's because of these high stakes that I stay involved.
Excellent, thank you. How about you, Jim Mars? How did you start into all of this?
Well, I've just always been a curious person. When I was working for the Star Telegram, I was on the third floor of a building in downtown Fort Worth, and I used the analogy that I'd be sitting there with other reporters, and let's say a guy comes running in all out of breath, and he says, "Hey, a flying saucer just landed in the park across the street," and then he runs off. The other reporters generally would roll their eyes and say, "Oh man, that guy's really nuts," you know. Me, I'd get up and go look out the window. Sometimes I might even go downstairs and go to the park. I want to know. I want to know what's going on. And I started off, I was a child of the 50s, 60s when science was king. You know, we were going to the moon. Everything had to have a scientific explanation. And so I've started off fairly skeptical about the idea of extraterrestrials and UFOs. But folks, after a lifetime of talking to pilots, both military and civilian, air traffic controllers, FAA people, government officials, police officers, you know, it's finally you hit a tipping point where you say, look, they all can't be nuts, and they're all not making something up. The UFO situation is real, it's happening. George, you probably remember when we were told that UFOs, there was nothing there, it didn't exist, they were just hallucinations.
Yep.
Or mass psychosis.
Hysteria.
Yeah, mass hysteria. And so even then, as a young reporter, I thought, hey, whoa, what a story. You know, we've got this contagious, heretofore unknown mass psychosis. But of course, that's not it, because today, everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's got a camcorder, and now we have a picture of them. So the question of, is there something there, that's done and gone. They're there. So now the question becomes, what is the alien agenda?
And there is an agenda. There's no doubt about that. Jim Marks. Ruben, how about you? What pushes? I know you're an expert on border UFO cases. You and Noe have done some incredible work on that. But what drives you into this subject matter?
Well, it goes back. Thank you very much, Rico and Noe. It's very interesting finding the mysteries that have been occurring, and I mean, we've come to the conclusion that UFOs have no borders. You know, they come from all over the world, and they pretty much have free access to the skies. The other thing about the recent release of the documents from CIA and Project Blue Book, that's opened up a lot of interest, of course, and thanks to the internet, many of you out there will be able to see these documents. I recently have in storage, I had received several boxes of files from friends of mine that have deceased, but I've become like a caretaker of their files. And I haven't had a chance to open up the boxes yet, but as I started to go through one box, I'm just totally floored. Because back then people used to write letters to each other, or communicate by newsletters, or documents or in forms. And then I started looking at this and said, oh my God, you know, there's FBI here, there's CIA, there's all this. And it just tells me that, you know, we're dealing with a phenomenon that's truly unknown, and yet we're now trying to figure out, well, what's their agenda? Why are they here? So people like Nick and Jim, of course, George having them on, as well as a number of other speakers, other interesting researchers to try to share their research with you. And I'm really glad to turn the mic over to my great friend and colleague, Mr. Noe Torres. Oh. That's your job, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you. That's what I'm here for. And now we have a driver who thinks he's the MC. If Noe happened to be a lifelong partner of mine, and he is not, let's not start that rumor, his name would be Noe Nory. Well, that didn't go over too well. Anyway, here's Noe Torres.
So I actually liked a girl in high school named Terry, and but it wouldn't have worked. Terry Torres. So
That didn't
Robin
go over well
was my last name. I think yours went over better than mine. I was a little kid, about 8 or 9, in deep South Texas. I grew up along the border in the area of McAllen, Texas. And it was a dark, rural area. In the 1940s, I hadn't been born yet. My parents had established their home there in a grove of orange trees. And my mom had an amazing encounter that she spent the rest of her life. When I came along in '56, and from then on, you know, later on when I was little, as I mentioned, 7 or 8 years old, she told me for the first time about the encounter. She had one night, she saw bright lights and heard a strange noise behind our home, very isolated from anybody else who lived in the area. And my older brothers were asleep in the home. She went out the back, went outside, and suddenly there was like a spotlight turned on her. And her dog, a large dog, I don't know what breed it was, started jumping up in the air and snapping its jaws at something above her. And she said that try as she might, she could not make her neck muscles move her head up to see what was above her head. But she knew it made a strange machine-like noise, and everything around her was illuminated. Being a religious person, she assumed an attitude of prayer, and she was praying, I guess, for survival and to make it through this encounter. And she doesn't know how much time elapsed, she told me, but suddenly the lights all went off as if somebody had turned off a light switch, she said. The dogs stopped barking, and everything was still. She spent the rest of her life, George, trying to figure out, puzzling over what happened that night. And when I was small, and she'd tell me this story several times, I would run to the school library. And ironically, I am a librarian and have been for over 20 years, became a librarian. But I would run to the school library and I would check out every book they had on UFOs. This was in the 60s, I grew up. And ever since then, I've had this deep interest in the topic. And I know that all of these witnesses, these hundreds of cases, the fact that the government has collected thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents about it, I know that where there's smoke, there's fire. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that this is a real events that people are talking about. And my own mother experienced that night. So that's essentially what happened to me.
You know, Noe, almost the same thing happened to me with my mother. She brought home Look magazine. You remember Look magazine a long time ago? And it had the interrupted journey in there, the story of Barney and Betty Hill, and that abduction case. And I'm reading this, and I must have been 12, 13 years old. And I was just obsessed with it. I couldn't get enough. And then I started reading books. I joined NICAP. I was a kid that joined the National Investigations Committee on aerial phenomena. It was just amazing for me, and I couldn't stop. And I said to myself, I want to go into broadcasting so I could interview people like this panel, because nobody's going to talk to me if I'm not. And that's what I did. That was my message, and that was the whole reason I did what I started to do. There's obviously something out there. How many of you saw the story last week that two separate astronomical institutions, Australia and Britain, have spotted what they think might be two large planet X's in our solar system? It's an amazing story. What is so amazing about it is the people that we've had on Coast to Coast over the years, the Zechariah Sitchins, the Nancy Leaders, the Mark Hazlewoods, the people who have said there's another planet in the solar system. They didn't have astronomical equipment. All they had was data from so-called extraterrestrials. They're right. They're right. And that has to make you wonder just how much is real. If they were right before scientists even found out about this, what else are they right about? And so when you look at Sitchin's work, God rest his soul, and he writes about visitations and genetically altering us, I think it's all right. I think it's all correct. Jim Mars, what do you think?
Well, you're stepping on my talk later on. That's exactly what I'm going to be talking about. Yeah, it's amazing because, and keep in mind that Sitchin didn't make this stuff up. We have accounts, and some of the oldest writings known to man, the Sumerian tablets. You know, and we can actually, it's weird, but we know more about the Sumerians that predate the Egyptians by thousands of years than we know about the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Romans, because they wrote things on papyrus and on paper, and that paper deteriorates and it gets destroyed and it burns up in wars. But the Sumerians would use a stylus to impress their cuneiform writing on clay tablets and then bake them. So turn them into stone, and there's thousands of these things still around in the world, most of them hidden away down in the basements of various museums. And only about 20% of them have been translated. But the ones that have been translated, and actually there's not a whole lot of argument about the translation. They talk about the Anunnaki, who translates those who came from the heavens to the earth, and how that they came down here and they were searching for gold, and that they knew about genetic manipulation, and that they tweaked the genes of a earth primitive and created a race, and it goes on and on like this. And nobody that I know of has successfully argued against this translation, but where they argue is over the interpretation. Because when these tablets were first discovered and interpreted back in the mid-1800s, they didn't know about atoms. They didn't know about space flight. They didn't even think it was possible for heavier than air flight. And so as a result, you can find pretty much the same stories that Sitchin talk about in the Encyclopedia Britannica. But you have to look under Sumerian mythology, because they said, oh, well, this must be their gods, and they're just making this stuff up. But they never called them gods. They just said the Anunnaki. And they come from this planet that circles through our solar system, Nibiru. And as George just said, now, you know, with every new discovery, we're finding more and more evidence that there really are things out there past the Oort cloud. And so, you know, our knowledge is forever expanding, and it's making it look like that we're kind of coming full circle. What we used to think was ancient history is now futuristic history.
And I think, Jim, one of the most incredible pieces of evidence that happens to be out there that the mainstream media doesn't pick up on is that etching from Abydos, where you clearly can see a helicopter etched on there, a spaceship, and to me, one of three things are happening. Either the artist was very clever about the future and just came up with it, or mankind is much older than people think, as Michael Cremo would say, and we had high technology, or we had high technology, but it was given to us by some extraterrestrial sources.
I think that the answer to that, George, is that our history goes back much further than anyone thinks, and the reason I'm convinced of that is because when I was in Egypt in 2009, I made a point to study the vertical water erosion on the Sphinx and around the Sphinx, and also on the Great Pyramid. Now, geologists will tell you that that can only occur from heavy rains, having sat out under heavy rains, and it washes those grooves, those vertical grooves, making water erosion. The same geologists will tell you there has not been significant rainfall on the Giza Plateau for more than 10,000 years. So this tells us that the Sphinx, the Great Pyramid, perhaps a few other structures, were actually in existence and sitting there under heavy rains more than 10,000 years ago. Well, the Egyptians only date back 5,000 years. So that leaves the Egyptians out. So there's obviously some big gaps in our knowledge of our history.
Ruben, tell us a little bit about your latest work with Noe on the crash in Mexico.
Thank you. Both Noe and I have been working on a series of books, and we've been investigating a number of crashes that historically go back from 1948, 1955, and of course 1974 in Coyame near Presidio, Texas. One of the recent projects that we worked on together, we worked on a book that was in Spanish. We have a great network with a number of Mexican investigators. And they wrote a book about aviation encounters. And today you're hearing pilots from all over the world that are encountering these UFOs flying very close to their passenger planes. And sometimes the effects of a UFO can be quite devastating in the sense that it could affect the flight instruments, since many of these airplanes are now run by computers. But we came across an extraordinary amount of cases by pilots, air traffic controllers, mechanics, near misses, and actually some accidents as well of these objects that have collided. And we put together a book. We did an English version of it, and hopefully that book, as well as the information that's in it, can be shared with the pilot, the airline community throughout the world, and with other research organizations, just like with NARCAP, which focuses on the anomalous phenomena that's occurring all over the world.
And Noe, I'll let you add to that too.
Yeah, Ruben, thanks for mentioning that. We had a great time working with Carlos Guzman from Mexico City and the other Mexican researchers. The book is called UFOs over Mexico, and it was a great undertaking because, frankly, I think, Ruben, a lot of those cases you weren't familiar with either. They have compiled a massive amount of information over many, many years of research. And the book has been very well received. Of course, the Spanish version of the book had become one of the most renowned books in UFO circles for many years. So when we worked with Carlos and his co-author to translate it to English, we brought it up to date and included the cases since the book was first published in the late 90s, right, Ruben? So we brought it up to date because they've amassed a whole bunch of more cases since the 90s. And he also was so intrigued with the mid-air collision of a plane and a UFO near Presidio, Texas, that he included a section in the book. That's the Coyame incident. He included a section, chapter in the book on UFOs over Mexico, since it was aviation related. So anyway, we just loved, and one of the things, George, that this points out, I think Ruben and I were on your show a couple of years ago, and we were talking, we made the statement that if disclosure does happen, which we know it will probably be based on the testimony of people in another country, not the United States. We have, as a society in the US, we have so much baggage about UFO secrecy that Ruben and I are convinced that the first legitimate disclosure will not happen in the US. It will happen elsewhere, possibly Mexico, possibly Europe.
Noe, why do you, Ruben, why do you think that there has been such a outpouring of sightings and experiences in Mexico? Why Mexico? What do you think's going on?
I'm sure that you're going to cover that in part of that answer in your lecture this afternoon, but Mexican culture predates ours and goes back to antiquity. And with the ancient Mayans and the ancient Incas, there are connections there with the so-called star people. And, you know, a very ancient civilization. Mexicans today retain a sense of this past identity, even westernized, even with the influence of European culture, of the Spaniards invading the country, and the way society has transformed. There is, at the core of Mexican society and philosophy, a link with the star people of the ancient past. And we see that in their ancient artwork, in the artifacts. I've been down to the big museum in Mexico City and really enjoyed looking at the Toltec artifacts and the Aztec sketches and artwork, and so it's just amazing the history, the antiquity that goes along with Mexican society, and it's just unfortunate to me that recently the country of Mexico has been so blasted in the media because of the way a few drug lords have tried to corrupt Mexican society. And that's unfortunate because that seems to be all the media is interested in these days. Ruben and I have had a lot of trouble pursuing some of these UFO leads in Mexico because of the massive focus on what the drug lords are doing in Mexico. You know, that's not Mexico. That's just a few corrupt people, just like we have in all other countries, just like we have in the U.S. Most of Mexico people are still honest, hardworking, willing to help out strangers if you travel around, and it's just unfortunate.
I've always said one way to minimize that issue is legalize drugs. Simple as that. You're not going to have any more people using them. The users will find them. And so you wipe out all those kinds of profits if you just legalize it, make it cheap. Crime goes down. It's just dramatic. You know, I had a guest on Coast to Coast last week. His name was Richard Shaw. And Richard works with L.A. Marzulli in the Watchers series. He has a new DVD out called The Torah Codes. And the Torah is the Hebrew version of the Bible. And they would find certain things and phrases in the Bible codes and in the Torah codes. You literally have to give them some verbiage, and then they go and look at it via computer. Well, they've got some incredible rabbis in Israel and in Europe who are studying this because it says a lot about prophecy in the future. On a whim, I told Richard, I said, just put my name in there and see what happens. There's no way my name is going to be in a 3,000 to 5,000 year old Torah. Ain't gonna happen. And he says, all right, we'll do it. So he says, I just need your birth date, and you know, I got your full name. And so he emailed it that night, it was on just last week, to the rabbis in Israel. They got back to him in an hour and said, who is this guy? And he said, what do you mean? He said, he's all over this thing. And so Richard calls me and says, they've asked for more information, some significant dates on you. And he'd ask me something, and I'd give him a date, and he said, I'll get right back to you. But I said, Richard, why? He said, George, you're all over the Torah. Your full name is in there. And in many places, it says mysteries and paranormal next to it. And I said, you've got to be kidding. And then I said, am I the Antichrist? Gosh, I hope not. If I am, I'm really sorry. You never know. So as soon as I find out, I'll announce it on Coast to Coast. I mean, this is really weird stuff. Tom, are you collecting some what I call phone call questions?
Yes,
No, you're not on. Let's turn on Tom down here in the corner, and we'll go through a series of questions for our group. Oh.
So let's start with...
You want to come up here, Tom? Well, you're going to need that mic, Noe. This doesn't happen on the radio.
While they get the other microphone fixed, you can just use this.
George, go to commercial. This is really bad. All right, so let's start
We'll
with...
be back in a moment on Coast to Coast Day.
We'll start with Mr. Nick Pope. Sarah from Austin would like to know if you think that extraterrestrials are biological beings.
Sarah from Austin, Nick Pope.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I suspect that, you know, if we are sharing this cosmos, we will not share it, we will not find that we share it with one other alien civilization. We will find a whole bunch out there. I mean, you know, in a sense, there being two intelligent civilizations in the universe is just as unlikely as there being one. There's going to be a whole bunch out there, so I think what we'll find, is variety. I think clearly some will be biological, but for those of you who were here yesterday, you'll remember that I mentioned a Royal Society discussion meeting that I attended in the UK in 2010, where Stephen Dick, a former chief historian of NASA, said that we may be living in a largely post-biological universe, and that when we encounter extraterrestrials, they may have evolved through that biological phase, and we may be dealing with what he termed immortal thinking machines. So, and also the idea of a machine intelligence, whilst sounding, of course, like something out of the Terminator movie franchise, does actually get us around some of the so-called practical problems of interstellar travel. Because you don't actually, for that, need any of these sort of, faster-than-light travel, warp drives, wormholes, anything like that. If you were a machine intelligence, you could simply plod along at sub-light speed, pretty much as we do with the Voyager and the Pioneer probes, and you could just shut yourself down and reboot. But I think we're getting into really interesting territory here. I mean, questions like what is consciousness, and will it be possible at some stage to download consciousness into a machine, into a computer? Might the first communication that we get actually arrive via an email from ET, perhaps? But I think that's why the question is a really interesting one. And my answer is, yeah, we may find biological entities, but I strongly suspect that if there are intelligences out there, a large number of them, just simply because it gets around the travel and longevity issue, may be machine intelligences.
And apart from, thank you. Apart from downloading your memory, let's say, onto a chip, if you clone a body and you are able to put that memory back into the brain, you literally live forever. Because outside of the soul, we are just our memory, our brain. We're a function of that. It's incredible. Ted Williams, the great Boston Red Sox player who has passed on, his head is in a cryogenic chamber, and they're waiting to be able to, clone him one day, but they want to be able to download his memory from his brain and put it into this new body, and you'll have another Ted Williams all over again. It's just amazing technology. Tom, what else do you have there?
For Mr. Jim Mars, Jim, can you talk a little bit about planet Nibiru?
Come to his lecture.
Yeah, right. Come to my lecture. We'll discuss that more. Basically, Nibiru, and it's going under various names. There's lots of websites out there. They talk about Wormwood. They talk about Planet X. Actually, you can go back to the 1980s, and the mainstream media was full of stories about that they were suspecting that there's another planet out beyond our solar system because they can tell from the perturbations in the orbits of the outer planets, Pluto and Uranus. And now, just recently, they now even saying there may be even more. But the idea was, and this was, of course, it was detailed by the Sumerians, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, that you have a big, huge planet that on an elliptical orbit, it goes outside of our solar system, comes way back around, and then comes through again about every 3,600 years. And when it comes through our solar system, then it begins to, cause problems and changing conditions in our solar system. And I might point out that, the big thing in the recent years has been, first it was global warming, which is now kind of, there's been so much fraud, so much controversy about that now they're simply talking about climate change. And I think we can all agree that, yes, the climate is changing. But I'm sorry, Al Gore, it's not because we're driving SUVs and cars and everything, and the reason I can say that is because the polar caps on Mars are diminishing, which means that ice is melting. There's ice on some of the moons of Saturn that is melting. The outer planets are becoming more luminescent. So whatever is going on, whatever this climate change is that's taking place on the Earth, it's actually solar system wide, okay? And this, to me, lends a lot of support to the idea that you've got this other planet approaching the center of our solar system, which is causing change. Yeah, gravity changes and electronics. And quickly on the idea of biological life, let me point out that, you know, we have intelligent biological different species right here on the Earth. There are plenty of studies that show that dolphins, for example, or whales, or even primates. If you've never seen Coco the gorilla, who can speak, has, you know, a vocabulary, you know, better than most 3-year-olds. So, you know, the idea of meeting somebody from another world that would have intelligence that's a no-brainer.
I've been doing some shows lately with Craig Campobasso, who's a Hollywood agent, who just did a small movie called Stranger at the Pentagon, based on Frank Strange's book, and a visitor named Valiant Thor, which is an incredible story, and how he talks about how in the 50s, this extraterrestrial came here to meet with Eisenhower and our Joint Chiefs to try to give us technology, and they turned him down. They turned him down, Jim.
They didn't want to give up authority.
That's right. Exactly right. Tom, what else you have done?
Ruben, this is for you. Mary from Texas would like to know if you know what happened to the wreckage from the 1955 UFO Texas crash.
Thank you. That's a question that Noe and I have been looking into. What we find in our...
And explain the case a little bit.
Yeah, the case of Willingham, which we just talked about just a few moments ago regarding the crash that occurred on the Mexican side of the border near Del Rio, actually up there in Langtree, where Colonel Willingham had observed this object flying over their flight formation, and then it made a 90-degree turn and it crashed on the other side. The thing that we keep coming across in our research, because we've written we've done other research of the gentleman up in Cisco Grove, California. Back in 1964, he had an encounter with beings, and he went to the Air Force and gave them his testimony and about where he had encountered these. It's close to in Northern California. And he said that weeks later, he went back to the area where he had his encounter, and he noticed that the entire area was raked. He found cigarette butts, and he saw that the whole area was cleansed. And we suspected, well, he told the Air Force, and they went back to perhaps look for any other evidence of the actual encounter. We found this true with Roswell, and this is where, again, where the military went in and went to the crash site and combed the entire crash area and removed any evidence of crash debris. Willingham, the same thing. 1955, the Mexican army was cordoning off the crash site. They were waiting for someone from the United States Air Force to arrive. Well, obviously, what we're finding out is American officials and military went over to the crash site and took the remnants of that crash somewhere else. And the thing that we found, and I don't remember if Willingham stated it in the last presentation, he said he flew back to the crash site 2 weeks later, and he said that area was completely combed. So they went back and retrieved it. The same with the crash in 1974 near Coyame, Mexico. And so we're seeing the same pattern. Immediately when there's a crash, there's an immediate response. by the military or whoever, whatever agencies to retrieve the evidence. So we find out through other sorts of leaks or through documents and that. So it's an ongoing investigation for all of us. We really don't know. We have speculation, maybe the Wrights-Patterson Air Force Base. There's some of the other places where crash UFOs or their debris are sent to.
Tom? Noe, this is for you. Do you think the Mexican government keeps UFO crashes secret?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I'm glad somebody asked that. We don't have a contributor for that one, but that is an astute question. Does the Mexican government keep UFO secrets, and specifically crash retrievals? Ruben and I have actually spent a lot of time looking into that issue and talking to our counterparts in Mexico. Ruben especially is the liaison for MUFON with the investigative groups in Mexico. And what we find is that the United States has always had inside people from our intelligence community who seem to be calling the shots in Mexico City. I mean, as far back as the 1950s. And Colonel Willingham was in touch, actually, with somebody from Mexico City that he described as being vaguely with U.S. intelligence. But there was a vagueness to what exactly the guy's role was, and we strongly suspect CIA. So there was somebody as far back as the early 1950s calling the shots on UFO evidence and retrievals in Mexico. Is the Mexican government hiding UFO secrets? We think the U.S. has had its hands deeply in the pockets of Mexican intelligence, governmental intelligence services, paying off the right people, and making sure that we, the U.S., got our hands on anything that was retrieved in Mexico dating back to the 40s. That's generally our take on it. Good question.
Go ahead, Tommy. This is for George Noory. George, Karen from Del Rio would like to know if you've ever seen a UFO.
Actually, for years, I never did. And then several years ago, I was at a conference, and I did see a couple. I'll explain that. Historically, when I go to these events, I'm always with Tom, my sidekick here. And, you know, we go to the events, we speak, we talk to great panelists like we have here. But I noticed that at every event that I had attended over the years, there was a guy sitting next to me with a brown paper bag. And Tom and I kept looking at each other at every event. I'm talking about no matter where we went, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, the same guy was there with a brown paper bag next to me. And, you know, after a while, it gets a little jarring. And we said, you know, we might have a problem here. And so we were at another event in San Jose, California. Same thing, we're at the bar, and a couple people behind me, this same guy is there with his brown paper bag. This time, he reaches into his bag. And I said, Tom, we best get ready on this one. And he pulls out night vision goggles. Turns out his name was Ed Grimsley. You've heard his name before. And Ed came up to us finally, and I said, you've been following me for 3 years. And he said, yeah, I just never had the nerve to ask you to come up on the roof with me. And I went, oh? Come up on the roof with you? And he said, no, I've got a whole bunch of people up there, and we're looking at UFOs through these night vision goggles. And I said, all right, that's intriguing. So up we went. And there he is with these goggles looking into the sky at what appears to be nothing. But through the goggles, you can actually see objects up there. Not insects, it could be satellites, But these objects were making 90-degree turns and stops. And it was unbelievable. And I spotted 2 of those. I don't know what they were. To me, they're UFOs because they're unidentified. But these things, they must have been up there 200 miles, just were darting across the sky, stopping, and then turning. And it was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. So I've seen 2 in my lifetime.
Thank you.
Mr. Nick Pope, if you were to come face to face with an alien, what would be your first reaction?
They're kind of scary looking, aren't they?
A face for radio.
Well, I think obviously it's one of those questions where it depends on the circumstances. I mean, if it comes towards you with claws sharpened and teeth bared, I think my reaction might be run. But, you know, taking it as a neutral scenario, of course, I guess the first thing I would do is try to extend the hand of friendship, both literally and figuratively. And I would go straight into question mode. I mean, I think I would have so many questions that I would want to ask. What is their history as a civilization? How did they overcome some of the problems that they must have faced along the way? Do they recognize any of the problems we have? Whether it's disease, poverty, warfare, intolerance, how do they get past that? And then I'd like to get into questions about their science, their technology, their art, their religion, their philosophy. I just want to know about them, and I would want to establish a dialogue. And I think that when one looks at people who are interested in this, whether they are people within NASA or the SETI community, or whether they are people in the UFO community, I think though there may be differences in our methodologies and our belief systems, I often like to say that perhaps some of the radio astronomers and some of the UFO community are looking for the same thing, but in different places and with different strategies. But, in all of this, there is more that binds us together than sets us apart, as someone once said. And so my response to that question is I would have questions. I would want to find things out. That would be my response.
Thank you.
And somewhere in those questions, Nick, you'd have to ask them, do they believe in God? I wonder what that answer would be. Because they're probably seeking the same things we are.
Well, at one of the Royal Society discussion meetings, there was a whole panel discussion on that, and people like the theologian Ted Peters was there, and I mean, there was actually quite a row between Ted Peters and the science communicator Paul Davies on this very issue. Ted Peters had some views about, the interesting question would be, what does alien religion look like? And Paul Davies responded with, what if extraterrestrials have no religion? So I think there's a debate to be had, but that will be one of the big issues.
Huge. Tom, let's take one more. Go ahead, Jim. You want to react to that?
I just want to say, I think that we already know that we got a problem because according to the stereotype, when the saucer lands and the little guy gets out, what does he say? Take me to your leader. Well, who's our leader?
Good question.
Who speaks for Earth? Putin doesn't speak for Earth. Obama doesn't speak for Earth. A lot of people don't think he even speaks for the United States. But I strongly suspect that that we're never going to have any kind of face-to-face confrontation with another species until we have someone who can speak for Earth.
Very well said, Jim. I was going to do a Bill Clinton joke, but there's some young kids in the audience, so I won't. Tommy, let's take one more question.
For Ruben. Ruben, do you have a favorite Hollywood movie depiction of an alien encounter?
that's a great movie. And there's a, well, like Jim, I'm a product of the 50s, and there were a lot of great sci-fi movies that came out. The day the Earth stood still, 1950. 15 was my favorite. Yeah, 1951. This Planet Earth. Just a lot of great movies. But my one of my favorites was a movie made Going to the Moon. It was made in 1902. That was the very first science fiction movie produced. And it was all based on special effects, just like today. But what we're seeing in Hollywood, there's a lot of movies coming out, alien invasions and shooting them up, there's a lot. But the really classic movies, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that really talked about the whole issue of contact. And I'm sure there's some other great ones out there. So to say one, it's pretty hard because there's so many that I've enjoyed. And hopefully someday we'll have some good, there are some good movies out there that I hear that are coming in. There's one on Project Blue Book, I believe, they're talking about the over 700 cases of unexplained files. There's another one coming out, the Legend from the Skies, about the Native American encounters. That's going to be released very shortly in January. And some other good ones that are in the works. So we have some really dedicated producers out there that are seeking the truth and bringing it to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
As we wrap up this panel, I want each of you to take a minute or so to just summarize your efforts, what you're doing in this field, and why. Noe, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, George. One of the really cool things that Ruben and I, and also Brad Newton, have been doing for the past 5 years is hosting events like this one all along the Texas border. Why the Texas border? Because it happens that the research that Ruben and I were doing at the time that we started these festivals centered on several events that happened along the border. And so we have a conference in Presidio every year in October, which started from based on our Coyame incident book. We have this conference based on the other Roswell, the Colonel Willingham case. We have a conference in Laredo and one in Edinburgh. Major incidents happened there. So, but the thing I was trying to get to is we started this as a way to have a forum, and Ruben and I at all of these have talked to hundreds, possibly thousands of people about their own UFO encounters, to give them a forum at which they can express their own experiences and beliefs and thoughts. Because in normal, everyday dealings, we are all hesitant to talk about UFOs in this culture, let's be frank. It's not something that you just blurt out in the workplace and expect a serious response. So Ruben and I, in these conferences, have had people come up and say, we thank you so much for having this because I don't feel comfortable talking about the encounter that I had or the fact that I've been visited many times over the years. The reward has come back to us for the effort that we put forward to have these conferences, and many-fold in these conversations and the friends that we've made along the way. So we are just so happy at the response here in Del Rio. We had a great response last year and again this year, and as well as the other cities where we have these events. And George, we want to thank you for being a part this year.
Very well said. Thank you, Noe. We've are always meeting people out there in the audience, and I'm sure maybe, if we're lucky, maybe someone out there may have a particular information or a clue to give us in regards to our research. And sometimes we find that. We find some gems of information. mainly because that person has had that information for quite a long time and has courageously they've come forward sharing the information. So really we owe a lot to our audiences. They're the ones that support us in our efforts. And so we thank you. I just wanted to say that maybe within this year, I've been in contact with some really good friends of mine that are also investigators in Mexico, and we're going back to the ancient alien concept. There's been some recent discoveries of some stones that several people have collected, and I had a chance to actually examine these stones, and there's these very interesting, I'm just blown away by the amount of detail. There's just no doubt, so you can see little saucers and little the engravings of these beings offering to these objects, their children, and there's so much detail in those. The problem that they're concerned about is that you can't not just show these rocks, or they would like to get cooperation from mainstream archaeologists, but the fear is that if they do, they'll keep them. And they won't, so those stones may never be able to be shared with society. And that's a kind of a dilemma, because you would need to rely on experts and other resources. But then there's always that possibility that may not happen. But we'll see. I'm very sure that there'll be some very exciting news that hopefully we'll get it out and be able to share it with all these folks and hopefully with George.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good morning.
I'm just an old reporter, and I know what I've seen, I know what I've heard, and I've covered a lot of territory, but I want to honor Noe, Ruben, these guys out actually getting the information, and I just pass it along. George and I are kind of in the same situation. We tell you what we learn. We hear other people. Nick, he was there in the trenches, working with the real stuff. And I also want to honor each and every one of you. The fact that you're willing to come away from your home, come down here, try to expand your conscience a little bit, try to learn about things. This is great. I wish we could get more people learning about all this. And yes, Ruben, you have a very serious concern there about turning over artifacts and they disappearing. This is a big part of my new book, Our Occulted History, and I'm going to touch on that at my talk this afternoon about how things tend to disappear into like the Smithsonian, and then they just don't come back out. And that's because everybody knows the Smithsonian is this great, institution of knowledge, but what you don't know is that it's all totally controlled. It's a government agency of the federal government. And if they get something that they decide they don't want you to know about, then it just goes away. And that's why I want everyone here to understand my little philosophy, which is none of us are as smart as all of us. So let's just all get together and figure out what's going on. Good part.
Well, I'm working on three main things at the moment. The first one is that I'm still continuing to investigate the Rendlesham Forest incident. That's the subject of my talk here this afternoon. I teamed up with John Burroughs and Jim Penniston to write this book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest. Monty, I think if you're out there, this is your copy, so come and get it from me afterwards, and I'll sign it. The paperback comes out, I believe, in March. So work on the Rendlesham Forest case continues. It really is a staggering case. The second thing is that I continue to be peripherally involved, even though I've now left the Ministry of Defence, with the ongoing, it's now 7 years, program to declassify and release the British government's UFO files. They told you last year that it had finished, then they found, oops, we've got some more files which we forgot about, and they'll be coming out later this year, so I'll be able to say something about them. The third and final thing is that I continue to do a lot of television work on this subject, as do, I think, most of my companions here. I've been involved with quite a few series recently. Season 2 of Close Encounters is coming soon. That's out of Canada, but it'll be shown down here. Season 2 of NASA's Unexplained Files. There's another new series called Mysteries from Space coming out. I just want to pick out one new one, though, that's just really started in the last couple of weeks. I was involved in filming it last year. It's called UFOs Declassified. It premiered on History Channel Canada 2 weeks ago, and 2 days ago, I believe, on the Yesterday channel in the UK. It's coming to the United States, actually, very interesting given what Jim just said, on the Smithsonian Channel, of all places. And so look out for that. I don't have an exact transmission date yet, but UFOs Declassified. And you know, some UFO shows, as I'm sure you know, are better than others. This is a good one, and not least because one of the clients is Smithsonian Channel. You can't just make claims, you have to be able to back them up with an audit trail of verifiable government documents from the National Archives, and that's what we've done. I was one of the consultants on this. So look out for that one, UFOs Declassified, because I believe that those of us in this field have an opportunity and perhaps a responsibility, whether it's through writing of books, appearing on TV, or whether it's people like George doing what he does on the radio, and of course he's got his own TV show. But I think all of us have a responsibility as communicators to try and get this information out there. And my view is always, I'm never going to tell you what to believe or what to. People are different and people have different views and different interpretations. But I think a lot of the TV work I do is aimed at getting information out there, and I will continue to do that because I genuinely believe that whatever we think about UFOs, whatever they believe they are, people have a right to the information. People have a right to know about this. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you go to Jim Mars's presentation, and we'll be back at 4 o'clock right here for a meet and greet as well. And so thank you for participating in this panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, a hand for all our panelists. Thank you, Mr. George Noory.
We're going to have a few announcements from Donna Reinford, the director of the Chamber, who has been instrumental in having these events. So Donna is going to come up in a minute. We've got a lot of interesting stuff planned for the rest of the day. And do you want to use the microphone down here, Donna?
I do.
Okay, so go ahead and tell the folks some of the cool stuff that's going on. Main Street has been blocked off in front of the theater. We've got live music. She'll tell you more.
Well, what do you think? How many of you were here last year? All right. Would you come again? Good, because we're going to have it again next year. So remember, this particular weekend, that's the weekend we're going to have it. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to know how many are from out of town. Wow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you've enjoyed it, please tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell them to all come back. We are really grateful to Noe and to his team, because without them, we could not present the things that are so well. So give them a round of applause. I'm Donna Langford, and I'm the Executive Director of the Del Rio Chamber of Commerce, and this is our second time to host a UFO Festival. And the more we have it, the more fun it is. So what we've got for you today, we have the street blocked off out here in front of the theater. We have vendor booths out here. Go not the next building, but the next building over, which is the Crest building. We have vendors in there, so please go by and listen. And well, we have music out on the street too. So be sure you listen to that. Go by and look at all the vendor booths. Come back. Just make a day of it downtown Del Rio. At 8 o'clock tonight, we're going to have a costume contest. So all of you just go back, come back, dressed in the best costume you can get. We're going to have a costume contest, and that'll be at 8 o'clock. Then, when this is, we're going to have another band. It's a rockabilly band. That's a local band from Del Rio, and they're called El Banditos and the Lounge Lizards. Right now, we're going to have a young man and his group that is a native of Del Rio. His name is Ferdy Gonzalez, and his group will be playing during this time. So y'all get out, have fun, and enjoy Del Rio, and make sure you come back to see us again. Thanks.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the vortex.